Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around, maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words, "Help!" I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancée had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancée climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, Nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 2-day trip through a national forest, a loop trail that climbed a ridge, offering a long stretch of exposed rock before descending back into dense pine forest. The route was well documented, moderate in difficulty, and heavily used in summer. But I had come in the early fall, just after the peak season, when the air was crisp and the crowds were gone. I parked at the trailhead before sunrise, checked my gear, and started up the path. The first few miles were easy, wide dirt trails, gradual incline, the sound of distant birds in the trees. I fell into my usual hiking rhythm, my boots pressing into damp soil, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. After about 4 hours, I reached the ridge, a long, narrow stretch of exposed rock, sloping gently upward. I took a break, sitting on a boulder, drinking from my water bottle. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. I looked ahead. The trail followed the ridge for another few miles before dropping into a valley, where I planned to camp for the night. I kept walking. The path was easy to follow at first, marked by small cairns, stacks of rocks left by other hikers. But as I moved further along the ridge, the markers became less frequent. I didn't think much of it at the time. The terrain was open with good visibility, and I could see where the trail should be leading. Then the wind shifted. A low, heavy gust swept across the ridge, colder than before. The sky had darkened, not storm clouds, but a dull, flat gray. I stopped, checking my map. The terrain didn't match what I expected. The ridge seemed narrower than it should have been, the drop-off steeper. I turned back the way I came, and nothing looked familiar. The cairns were gone. The boulders I had passed earlier weren't there. It was just open rock, sloping downward on both sides, with no clear path. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had a compass. I had my map. I had daylight. I moved carefully, picking my way back toward where I thought I had come from. But the terrain kept shifting. Small ridges and dips that hadn't been there before. I checked my map again, trying to orient myself. If I kept heading west, I would eventually hit the tree line, and from there I could find the trail again. I walked for over an hour. The trees never came. The landscape stretched endlessly in front of me. Barren rock, empty ridges. My legs ached from the uneven ground. My throat was dry, despite my water. Then I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was another cairn, a small stack of stones, slightly off balance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cairn at all. It was a pile of bones, not animal bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt, staring at them. The bones were old, yellowed, weathered by wind and rain. Some had been cracked as if by pressure. They were arranged in a rough circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I stood up, my breath coming fast. I turned, and I saw more, scattered across the rock in irregular intervals, small piles of bones, some barely visible under thin layers of dirt.
A femur, a shattered skull, a ribcage collapsed inward.
I backed away, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. This was something else. I turned sharply and kept moving. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, heavy. My own footsteps sounded wrong against the rock. Too loud, too sharp. I needed to get off this ridge. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to run. I moved downhill, hoping to find a slope that would lead me back to the trees. But the ground kept tilting in ways that didn't make sense. Angles that felt wrong, dips that should have been climbs. Then I saw the cave, a narrow opening, barely visible in the rock face, partially hidden by a ledge. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go near it. But I needed shelter. I needed a place to stop, to think. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp. The space wasn't deep, just a small hollow in the rock, barely tall enough for me to stand. But the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, uneven gouges, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. I stepped closer, running my fingers over them. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a frantic repetition of shapes. Tallies, hundreds of them carved deep into the stone. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. I turned to leave, and outside the cave, less than 50 feet away, something moved. It was low to the ground, barely more than a shadow against the rock. Crawling, moving with deliberate, jerky motions. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I scrambled down the ridge, slipping on loose stone, my pack throwing me off balance. My knees hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my legs. I pushed forward, breath burning in my chest. The landscape blurred, rocks, dips, uneven ground. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then trees. The moment I saw them, I sprinted. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. My boots slammed into soft dirt. I kept going, running until my lungs felt like they would split. Then I collapsed. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The forest was silent, normal. I pulled out my map, my compass. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold them. But I wasn't lost anymore. I could find my way back. I walked for hours, refusing to stop. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I never reported what I found. I never told anyone about the bones, the scratches, the thing I saw, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew somewhere out there in the empty stretches of rock, in the places where the trail disappears, there are things you aren't supposed to find. And once you do, they don't let you go. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. I had left the city early, hoping to reach the place by late afternoon, but the last stretch of road was nothing but gravel and potholes. It slowed me down more than I expected. My truck bounced and groaned over the uneven path, tires spitting dust and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other vehicles, not even an old hunting shack. Just miles of thick forest closing in from both sides, the trees growing taller and denser as I climbed higher into the hills. I had rented this cabin for a full week. I needed the break. Work had been draining me dry, and I couldn't stand the noise of the city anymore. I didn't want to hear cars honking or people yelling or the endless ringing of my phone. I wanted silence. I got what I asked for. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Small, isolated, and simple. Just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water, just an old rain barrel outside that was half full from the last storm. A shed stood a few yards away, filled with firewood and rusted tools. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, damp with the scent of pine and earth. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just whined through the branches. Perfect. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been here in months. Dust floated in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small, grimy window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I set my gear down and took a look around. The cot was covered in an old wool blanket. A few dead leaves curled in the corners. The wood stove was cold, a few charred logs sitting untouched inside. A stack of old newspapers sat on the table, yellowed and brittle. I dropped my bag beside the cot and got to work setting up. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled the lantern with oil, and checked my food supply. I had packed everything I needed: canned beans, jerky, rice, a couple of protein bars. Enough to last the week. The first night, I kept things simple, heating up a can of chili on the stove and eating in silence. By the time the sun set, the forest outside had become a black wall. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The cabin had only the lantern and the soft glow of the stove. Everything else beyond the window was pitch black. I stared out for a while, listening. Nothing, not even crickets. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to bed early, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. Something was moving outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened, straining my ears. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't darting around like a raccoon or sniffing like a deer. It was deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wooden walls. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, peering out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited. The footsteps had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, climbed back into bed, and lay awake for hours listening. Morning came slow. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold. I sat up, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. My mind was still foggy from the restless night. Then I saw the footprints, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The dirt around the porch was soft from the recent rain, and the tracks were clear. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the window before trailing off into the trees. My stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. The prints were human, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe some drifter had been passing through. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. But why would someone be wandering barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The forest was still, the air heavy and damp. The tracks led toward the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven 6 hours to get here. I had planned this trip for months. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been half dreaming the footsteps in the night. I decided to stay. I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopped wood, cleaned up the cabin, took a short hike, making sure not to wander too far. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to lock the door. I woke up to the creaking of the porch. Someone was standing outside. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboards groaned under slow, careful steps. Then silence. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, clicked it on. The light reflected off the window, blinding me for a moment. I squinted, heart pounding. Then I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. Filthy, smiling. I recoiled, my pulse slamming in my ears. By the time I grabbed the hatchet from beside my bed and turned back, the face was gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight out. Nothing but empty woods. The trees swayed in the wind, branches creaking. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set, dozens. They surrounded the cabin. Some led to the window. Others stopped at the door. My stomach turned. I had been surrounded all night. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, shoving my gear inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking. The wires had been cut. My chest tightened. My head felt light. I turned, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt them watching. I grabbed my bag, my hatchet, and started walking. The nearest road was miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I walked fast, then faster, then I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization. A small gas station on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, breathless, hands shaking. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't explain. I didn't know how to. I hitched a ride back to the city. Never went back for my truck. Never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but they had been close. Too close. I've been hiking solo for years. Something about being alone in the woods always felt right to me. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of moving through untouched nature without a schedule or responsibility. It cleared my head like nothing else could. That's why I took the trip. It was late September, just as summer was starting to fade into fall. The days were still warm, but the nights had that creeping cold that reminded you winter wasn't far away. Perfect hiking weather. I had planned for a 2-day trek, one night in the woods, nothing extreme, just a break from normal life. The trail I picked wasn't popular. That was intentional. I didn't want crowds, didn't want families with screaming kids or loud groups blaring music from portable speakers. I wanted solitude. I found a place deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from home. A long, winding dirt road led to the trailhead, and by the time I got there, my car was the only one in the small gravel parking lot. That was a good sign. I took my time checking my gear before heading in. Backpack loaded with food, water, tent, and emergency supplies. A map, a compass, a flashlight with extra batteries. I even had a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't careless. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well defined, though clearly not used often. Fallen leaves covered the dirt path, crunching under my boots as I walked. The forest was dense, but the sunlight filtered through in streaks, warm and golden. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was exactly what I needed. By midday, I had covered about 6 miles. I stopped near a creek, ate a protein bar, and drank some water while listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. No cars, no voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. I felt good. That feeling didn't last. After my break, I got back on the trail. The plan was to go another 4 or 5 miles before setting up camp for the night. The path started to get rougher, not difficult, just less maintained. Fallen branches forced me to step carefully, and parts of the trail were narrow with steep drop-offs to one side. That's when I saw the first sign that something was off. A boot print. It was old, partially washed out from rain, but it was there. Someone had been through here before me, which wasn't strange on its own. But what was strange was how deep it was. Like whoever left it had been carrying something heavy. I didn't think much of it at first, just something I noticed. I kept walking. The trees grew thicker, the sunlight dimming as the canopy closed in above me. The trail felt different now, more overgrown, less defined. I checked my map. I was still on the right path, at least I should have been. Then I saw the second footprint. This one was fresher, and it wasn't alone. There were several, all leading in the same direction I was going. But something was wrong with them. They weren't normal hiking steps. They were erratic, spaced unevenly, like someone had been stumbling or limping. A cold feeling settled in my gut. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had gotten tired, maybe they had a bad knee. There were 100 explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept moving. The trail got worse. The further I went, the less it looked like a real hiking path. The trees grew closer, the underbrush thickening. I checked my map again. I should have reached a fork in the trail by now, a spot marked on the map where the path split. One route leading to a scenic overlook, the other continuing deeper into the forest. But there was no fork, just an unbroken stretch of trees in every direction. I stopped, took a deep breath. I had been following the trail. I hadn't gone off course, but now the trail wasn't there. I turned around. The path behind me was gone. That wasn't possible. I had just come from there. But when I looked back, all I saw were trees, thick and unbroken. The footprints, mine included, were gone. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavier. The forest was silent.
No birds.
No wind. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint, distant, like something moving through the trees. Not an animal. Something bigger. I turned in slow circles, scanning the forest. Nothing. Just trees, stretching in every direction. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm. Took out my compass. The needle spun uselessly, refusing to settle. That shouldn't have been possible. I pulled out my map, but it felt pointless. None of the landmarks matched what I was seeing. The landscape around me was different from what had been marked. I wasn't lost. Something else was wrong. I picked a direction and started walking. I needed to find anything familiar, a landmark, a clearing, even just a way out of the thick trees. I kept my breathing steady, moving carefully, trying not to panic. Then I saw it. A structure. Not a house, not a cabin. Something smaller. A metal cage. It sat in a small clearing, rusted and old. Too big for an animal trap, too small for a proper holding cell. The bars were bent in places, the door hanging open. and inside, something lay crumpled on the ground. Bones, a mix of animal and human. I stared at it, stomach twisting. Then, behind me, I heard movement. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn around. I walked. Then I walked faster. Then I ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I thought I was going to collapse. Then suddenly I was back at the trailhead. I don't remember how I got there. One moment, I was deep in the woods, running from something I never saw. The next, I was standing beside my car, gasping for breath, covered in scratches and dirt. I didn't question it. I just got in my car and drove. I never went back. Some places aren't meant to be found. I always preferred solo camping over group trips. I liked the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. No schedules, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. This trip was no different. I had planned it for months, choosing a remote spot deep in the wilderness of Washington State. It was far from any official campsites, a place I found on an old topo map. A valley nestled between steep ridges, with a river running through the middle. The nearest road was over 10 miles away, and even that was nothing more than an unmaintained Forest Service road. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Isolated, untouched, quiet. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were on a faint, overgrown trail, but eventually I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. The forest was thick, dense with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called out from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the steady rush of water. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already dipping low. The river was just as I'd imagined it. Clear, fast-moving, lined with smooth rocks. I found a flat spot on the bank and started setting up camp. First, the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood, stacked it neatly, and got a small fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The heat felt good against the evening chill. I cooked a quick meal, ate while staring into the flames, and let my mind settle into the rhythm of the woods. As the fire crackled, I started to get that feeling. The one I always ignored at first. The prickling at the back of my neck. The sense of being watched. It was common when camping alone, just a natural reaction to being so exposed. My brain playing tricks on me, filling the silence with imagined threats. I brushed it off and focused on the fire. The woods around me were quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing unusual, but then I heard something, a soft crunch. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A footstep. I froze, my heart hammering. I listened. Silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just a branch falling. I waited, every muscle tensed. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam flickered over trunks, branches, undergrowth. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up longer than I had planned, letting the fire burn low before finally forcing myself into the tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every sound felt magnified, the river, the wind, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something was wrong. I listened. The fire was out, the night deep and black. The river was still rushing, the wind still whispering through the trees. Then I heard it, a sound close to my tent. Soft, careful, a footstep. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight with slow, deliberate movements. My fingers wrapped around it, my thumb pressing against the switch. I waited. Another step. Closer this time. I clicked the light on. The beam shot through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. Shadows shifted. Something moved just outside. I barely breathed. The shape didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly it backed away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shoved my gear into my pack. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever was out there came back. As I was taking down my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. They circled my campsite, stopped just outside my tent. I hiked out fast. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Took me almost the entire day to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there on the empty dirt road, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck, tore down that road faster than I ever had in my life. I never went back to that valley. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I stopped camping alone after that. I had been planning this hike for months. Ever since I saw a post about the remote backcountry trails in Montana, I knew I had to go. The pictures showed vast, untouched wilderness, dense forests, jagged peaks, and long, winding rivers cutting through the valleys. It looked perfect, the kind of place you could go for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no noise, no people. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I picked a route that wasn't well-traveled. It was about 30 miles out and back, cutting through thick pine forests, over high ridges and past deep, isolated lakes. The elevation gain was brutal, but I was ready for it. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, enough food for 5 days. Everything was set. I drove out early, the sun barely up, the roads empty. By the time I reached the trailhead, there was only one other car in the lot, an old truck with faded paint and mud caked on the tires. I didn't think much of it. Probably another hiker already out on the trail. I checked my pack one last time, tightened the straps, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a slow climb through dense forest. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. The trail was narrow, winding between massive trees, the ground soft with fallen needles. Birds called from the branches, and now and then, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. A squirrel, maybe a deer. After about an hour, I reached the first real climb. The trail turned steep, the dirt loose beneath my boots. I leaned forward, using my trekking poles to push myself up. My breathing grew heavy, sweat starting to build under my pack. I stopped once to take a sip of water, looking back down at the forest below. The trees stretched out endlessly, dark green and unbroken. No roads, no buildings, just wilderness. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge. It was the perfect place to rest. Flat ground, a clear view of the valley below. I dropped my pack and sat down, stretching out my legs. I took a deep breath, enjoying the silence. That's when I noticed something. At the far end of the clearing, near the treeline, was an old fire ring. Just a circle of blackened stones, half covered in dirt and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But next to it, half buried in the grass, was something else. A boot. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, the laces missing. I walked over and picked it up. Inside, the insole was worn down to nothing, the toe caked with dried mud. Someone had left it here a long time ago. I looked around, but there was nothing else. No pack, no other gear, just the boot. I tossed it back down and headed out. The trail dropped steeply after that, winding down into a deep valley. The trees grew thicker, the air damp and cool. I passed a stream, the water clear and fast-moving, then started the next climb. It was slow going, my legs already tired, but I pushed through. I wanted to reach the lake before dark. It was just after 6 when I finally saw the water through the trees. The lake was small, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick forest. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky. I found a flat patch of ground near the shore and set up my tent. After eating, I sat by the water, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The air was still, the forest silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional ripple on the water's surface. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just a few depressions in the dirt near the water's edge. But they were fresh, too fresh. I stood up, my skin prickling. The prints were barefoot. Whoever left them hadn't been wearing shoes. And they weren't mine. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was just a wall of darkness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had come down for a drink. Maybe I was just seeing things. I went back to my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Just outside my tent. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound was close. Too close. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. When morning finally came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The forest was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But my bear spray was gone. I packed up fast. My whole body was on edge. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. I needed to get out. I moved quickly, barely stopping for water. The whole way back, I felt it. That prickling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. But the old truck was gone. And nailed to a tree near the lot was something I hadn't seen before. A boot. The same one I had found on the ridge.